Good afternoon. My name is Fola Ojuola, and I want to present to you today a research proposal on using the human performance technology model as a framework for implementing gamification in sub-Saharan Africa. Now the word gamification, it's something that some of you might be familiar with. It's a concept of using gaming design construct in a non-game context, such as education. It's also found in the military, it's found in the healthcare system, it has found itself into pretty much different spheres of life where you use the concept of challenge and reward system and the thing that goes into the fun of playing a game into using it for constructive activities such as education. It takes advantage of the human psychological predisposition to engage in gaming. We find it fun, it's very stimulating. And so when we take that predisposition and we transfer it into the area of teaching and learning, it motivates people to want to learn stuff that might be harder for them to normally learn. And research has shown that it has an impact on teaching and the learning process. Well, gamification by itself has the potential to transform the educational experience of African countries as they embark on an effort to decolonize their educational system. So, we do know from research that a lot of the countries in the sub Saharan Africa have their educational system European centric. And so a lot of the textbooks take examples from things from Europe and North America that does not really exist in their natural environment. And so to study, they have to overcome the cultural differences, the differences in worldview before they get to the subject of mathematics or physics or social studies. You can just imagine somebody studying about politics and studying politics from a worldview of the capitalist system in a country that has king, a country like Eswatini that has just kings. It's difficult for them, for students, to really understand the educational construct that you're talking about just because it's not something that they can see on a day-to-day basis where they live. So it's important to realize that games are prevalent around the world. And so we can use the principles that goes into gaming in the field of education. And so existing research on gamification is primarily descriptive and survey based. So a lot of the research that I have found describe what gamification is, describe the game theory and how you use that in an educational setting. We've had systems that have been designed for students to use, and it allows them to go from different levels of difficulty, allows them to be able to challenge other students, allow them to have a reward system. They can fail as often as possible and go back to those things until they learn them. So it's really nice, but a lot of the research has just been descriptive about what it does and how it has been used. And so it's important for us to have a research that is um, that is qualitative and quantitative in nature so that we can do some measurement and also have a system for us to be able to find out what it does in terms of the performance. Does it increase the human performance of the student or not? Those are questions that are valid questions that we should be asking in the research community. So the purpose of this qualitative study is to use an interpretative design methodology to discover and document the uses, challenges, and the potentials of gamification, especially in sub-Saharan African schools. I am going to be using the human performance technology, shortly HPT model, as a framework to survey people who are users of gamification in education. The HPT model has some key elements. It has analysis, design, development, implementation, maintenance, evaluation, and change management. I'll be talking in more details about the elements that has that HPT model encompasses. The data analysis will determine the extent to which instructional practitioner use key elements of the HPT model when they attempt to adopt the potentials of gamification in sub-Saharan African schools. Introduction to the problem. The educational system in most African countries is rooted in their colonial past. Like I said earlier on, a lot of it has the roots from the European and the North American continent. That's for the sub-Saharan African countries. For those who are in the northern part of Africa, a lot of their educational system is gleaned from precedences from the Arabian world. So we are looking at a whole continent that does not really have educational systems that are centric to their native cultural system and their worldview. So it's a problem because the African worldview is largely different from the European worldview. The African worldview is communal, it's very cooperative, it's spiritual in nature, and it's reciprocal in the way it operates. I'll give you an example so that you can have an insight into what I'm talking about. It's it's common in sub-Saharan Africa that you would have a neighbor take all the kids in the neighborhood to school, and then another neighbor will pick all the kids, and then they will go to his house and eat breakfast or eat lunch, and go to another neighbor's house to have dinner. It's just a common thing that you will find in sub-Saharan African, and those are things that you don't really have in the fabric, in the educational fabric of these countries. Those are things that are taken away when kids go to school, where they have to compete and wear uniform and behave in a way that is not native to the way that their culture and their worldview dictates. So, gamification in education, in the most basic terms, is the use of game elements such as challenge, score, and achievement to learning objectives. So, you'll use those characteristics of gaming and 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 use them in an educational setting in such a way that people think that they are playing a game, but they're learning at the same time. So the learning is a real endeavor. The gaming principle should aid the learning. So the reason why we want to introduce that into the educational system, it's not for the game itself, it's for them to overcome the inertia, and to be motivated to learn. The other thing that gamification does is to stimulate and engage student active involvement in the learning process. We know from research that students are given to playing games by themselves, just being motivated, not by their parents, not by their teacher. So if we can use the same principle for the learning and they get to learn, then that way they will have overcome the inertia or the motivation factor that goes into learning. We do know from research also that the millennial generation with deep game awareness is the largest and most diverse population group to ever attend college. Gamification is an evolving concept in research. It has very few systematic studies that has been done, and in fewer studies have been done to look at the impact of gamification on teaching and learning process. So we don't have a lot of literature that has any framework to show us how the performance of the student and the teachers and the school system have been impacted. And this is so important that you are not looking at the gamification as a concept, but what it does to the learning process. And we don't really have any research for the sub-Sahara African. Christopher Papel in 2014 says that 70% of the world's population can be considered gamers, with 50% identified as casual gamers and 27% classified as moderate gamers. So this research would explore whether institutions, especially schools in sub-Saharan Africa, could effectively implement gamification by using the human performance technology model as a framework. So we want to be able to look at the effectiveness of gamification uses in sub-Saharan Africa, and we're going to look at it through the framework of the HPT model. The HPT model provides a framework to help diagnose both performance problems and opportunities within an organizational system. The model also helps, it guides us in the selection and implementation of an intervention. So when a gap is identified, the framework also helps us to be able to implement an intervention program and ensures that there's an evaluation that is done throughout the process. Let me give you some background to this research work. Now, the use of gamification has been tested in some developing world, especially in Asia. And in 2018 in Sri Lanka, it was discovered that when a gamified tablet application to teach grade 3 students mathematics was used in a particular school, the conclusion of the research is that there was a remarkable shift from a teacher centric learning to a student centric learning. The students were quite interested in learning mathematics because they were now in charge. They didn't have to go to a school and just listen to a teacher all day long. They could take control of the learning process. They could take the tablet and use it at a time that was convenient for them, and they could devote their time to learning the in and out of the application any uh, without any assistance from the instructors or from the teachers. So they discovered also that the students in the school took more ownership of the learning process. So they studied more by themselves. They studied when they were at home, and it's important to realize that games are woven into the fabrics of the African culture. So when students in sub-Saharan Africa leave school, 80% of them are going to play one game or the other within a period of 2 to 3 days. So it's important to realize that games are native to the sub-Saharan African. It's encouraging. It's part of what these countries consider to be part of their daily routine. Students across the African continent have not been matched with educational content that reflects their native environment. I mentioned that earlier on. and this is documented research, that a lot of the educational system within Africa is European centric, and that creates a clash of worldviews. And this worldview from the educational setting regulates how the culture is looked at. The lexicon that are used within the African culture are not replicated in the textbooks or in the activities across either the primary, the tertiary institutions. So you have people that are living two different worldviews, one that they grew up in, and the other one that is given to them by the educational system. So the students on the African continent are taught science, arts, social sciences, and other relevant subjects at the expense of their esteemed culture. For example, I want you to understand from the African worldview that the people embrace a lot of things that we might look at in an European or North American context as not being part of the society. Things like interpersonal relationships that exist between individuals and groups, that you have through bantering, through family reunions, and through communal festive activities. So those are things that um, are age-long cultural dimensions in the African culture that are not used in the educational setting. There is generally, when you look at the sub-Saharan African countries, a lot of things, decisions are made by the families. The students or people don't really go out and just decide things. They look at the effect of their decisions on the family setup, on the extended family setup. But then when they get to school, they are made to make decisions just based on the things that they like, based on the way that they view things. So you're going from a communal way of thinking to an individual way of thinking. And those are two different worldviews that over the years have created a lot of crisis in the sub-Saharan African setting. Let's look at the theoretical framework. The HPT model also guides the selection and implementation of a needed intervention and aids in the evaluation throughout the process. So, the good thing about the HPT model is that any gap that is identified, there's a guide in the model that allows the users to be able to select appropriate solutions, and then it also guides in the implementation of those solutions or intervention, and there is continuous evaluation that is done while the solution is being implemented. So I'll just take a little time and talk to you about the model itself. If you look at it, it has different subsystems, all interconnected, and it has 7 segments that are identified. The segments are the analysis, the intervention, the selection, the design and development, implementation, and maintenance and evaluation. And these are all connected. When we're looking at the HPT framework, we're looking at a segment that has change management in the middle part. That's an overarching segment of the HPT process. There's change management in every path. And so it's important to understand that the work and the staff, what they do is going to undergo a fundamental change. Sometimes not so radical, sometimes completely radical, but there's going to be a change when you have an introduction into in a system. And that change needs to be identified, and the framework allows us to be able to do that and to be able to ensure that the change is not disruptive, but it enhances the performance of the organization. So I've talked about how we can use HPT to improve organizational structure, and it helps also institutions to attain performance goals. It also helps to be able to manage introductions of new applications or new designs into the system itself. And so this helps the school system to be able to do an end-to-end appraisal of their current system, and then also look at what's going to happen when they introduce gamified application into the system, into the school system, and helps them to be able to do that introduction in a very seamless and in a way that enhances the performance of the school and the students, and then be able to sustain it over a period of time. The HPT model is essentially a science and an art of improving people, process, performance, organizations, and ultimately society. So you can take this model, and the goal is improvement, human improvement, and you improve the process when it enhances um, the the performance of the people. And so you're looking at the organization, you're looking at the process, you're looking at the people, and ultimately you're looking at the society. So this the HPT model has a could have a fundamental effect on the sub-Saharan African schools in terms of ensuring that the things that are prevalent in those societies are, are used in the school system to enhance the learning process, so that students are going to school and their worldview is preserved, they're able to learn properly, and they're able to maximize their potential. The model is based on theories from behavioralism, from instructional system design, from organizational design, from change management, from evaluation and management, and it recognizes that there are related issues that may cause performance problems and opportunities. So it's extremely it's comprehensive, and it looks at different areas and interacts and puts them together in a very nice model for you to be able to understand what are the causes of performance, what are the gaps, and what are the things that you can do to the gaps to ensure that the level of human performance that is required is achieved. We talked about the five major steps of the model already, which is the intervention selection, the analysis, the intervention selection, the design and development, and the maintenance, the evaluation, and the change. I want to talk a little bit about the second major step in the HPT model, which is making recommendation for intervention or solution to close the identified gaps. It's important to realize that when the gaps are not properly identified, then it's difficult for you to design against something that you don't know. So to understand exactly what's going on, why are the students failing, or why are they not doing as well as they should be doing, the why of the performance needs to be understood before any design is preferred. And so the HPT model allows us to be able to do that. That we can do an exhaustive analysis of the system to understand the gaps. And so our design is pretty much more robust because we have a fair understanding of exactly what the gaps are within the system. And then when we do an intervention system, and it also has to be maintained. So an intervention system can't be something that would just really work for a period of time. It has to be something that can be sustained over a period of time. So the process involves putting the intervention in action. And so this framework gives us a platform where we can identify the gaps, we can look at the possible solutions, and then we can manage the change within the organization, and then we can put the intervention into practice. And the fourth step in the HPT model is the evaluation, which can happen at four levels. And I think I've already talked about that in the other slides. So successful implementation of the intervention requires that the entire institution is ready for the change. So it's going to require change, but this is a change that comes with a lot of education and development and understanding. So the model would not just say, oh, you need a change, but the reason for the changes are properly articulated. So you can see why the change is needed. You can see where the performance is right now, and you can see where you want to go to and how the change connects to the future performance expectation of the institution. And so this helps the institution to be able to fully have a picture of a roadmap, so to say, of where they are right now, where they want to be, why they want to be there, and what they need to do to be able to get there. And so the resistance to changing things are less when the HPT model is employed. So in this research work, I am going to be collecting data and overlay those data on the HPT model. I'm going to be using those data using an interpretive design methodology to collect the data and to design the study. And that would allow me, the researcher, to be able to look at the uses and look at the challenges and look at the potentials of gamification in sub-Saharan African schools. There's an assumption that the study has, and because there's already gamified application in these schools that I'm going to be looking at in sub-Saharan African. So I'm assuming that they have a basic understanding of what gamification is, and they've interacted with it over a period of time, and so they are not novice. So some of the questions that I'm going to be asking them in the surveys and questionnaires, I'm assuming that because they already have experience doing some work on their iPads, so they understand how the game theory really works. And so that's an assumption, and they understand how to manage that process. I'm also assuming that they also understand some concept of change just because they have those systems in those schools currently. My assumption that the researcher is making is that they have gone through some changes in their learning process, and so they understand that it's part of what it takes to move from one system to another system. So these are the research questions that will guide the the research. The following research questions will guide the study. Number one, I want to find out to what extent can HPT principles and processes be used to plan and implement gamification in sub-Saharan African schools. Number two, also the researcher would like to find out the challenges of using HPT model to implement gamification in sub-Saharan African schools. So the first thing is when the gamification system right now does not really have any framework that that is being used in the 5 schools that have been identified. So they do have gamified applications. They do use gamification principles, but they don't have a framework to be able um, to tell exactly the human performance impact of using those applications. So I really want to find out as a researcher if when you use HPT principles, how they can they can tell exactly where they are in terms of the impact of those gamified application, and what were they thinking, where did they want to get to when those things were introduced, and are they there now, or what are the plans for them to really get there. This study is significant because, number one, using the theory games, using gamified application that is designed for the sub-Saharan African continent allows the student, number one, to take control of their learning process. So they take more time and go to the labs. And in addition, the data result will identify challenges that other schools could avoid. So there were lots of duplicate issues that, especially schools that are controlled by the mission fields or that are controlled by the government. And if they keep making exactly the same mistakes in rolling out initiatives across the schools, that is costing a lot of money and a lot of human resource that is going to waste. But when you would apply a model like the HPT model, then it's clear for them, it will be clear that they could see exactly what the problems are in a particular school, in these 5 schools. And so they could use that as the basic to ensure that the other schools, the rollout in the other schools is more seamless and easier to do. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the research design. Going the researcher is going to be using interpretive methodology, and it's a qualitative study, and so it's going to utilize data from 5 Saharan African schools that have implemented gamification in recent years. They all have gamified applications on different subjects that the students are currently using. In addition, the researcher will use data that is gathered from follow-up interviews with study participants. That would include teachers and students who agreed to be a part of this research. And I'm going to also be using publicly available documentation review to explore and demonstrate how HPT model might be used as a framework to implement gamification. How did they come to that conclusion that this was good for them? How was the introduction done? What documents are publicly available that I can see? Is there a system that is designed and well documented that can tell me a roadmap of exactly the concepts and the introductions, the evaluation of the gaps and the intervention, the implementation? So I'm going to be looking at public documentation to see if that is available. This design, so the basic interpretive design study involve 4 steps. Number one, shaping the problem. So I've described to you what the problem is in the African continent, especially in sub-Saharan African. I told you exactly why gamification is important, because it allows them to be able to retain their worldview, and that is so important to the learning process. And then secondly, it allows you to be able to select a sample. So we selected 5 schools in sub-Saharan Africa that already have gamified application in use, but they don't really have a framework that they can articulate that they are using. So it's been introduced, but no framework. And so it also allows the researcher the opportunity to collect and analyze data from different perspectives and then to write up the results. So five schools for our target population, five schools in sub-Saharan African who have successfully implemented gamification have been identified as potential sites for the research. And these are schools that have gamified application for a period of a year and above, and whose they got enough population between 12 and 21. Um, they are fluent in English language, 45% female, 55% male, typically representative of the population in these countries. The sample, the sampling method that is going to be used, the study will use purposeful sampling. So this sample method would allow the researcher to discover, understand, and gain insight quickly from the research population. So the the sample and the sample sites are purposefully chosen to ensure that there is maximum insight from the research study itself. So the sample size is 1,500 students in five distinct different schools in the sub-Saharan African countries. And the research will be conducted in the natural school settings of the students and the teachers. The data collection and analysis process that will be carried out for this research. So the data collection will be through electronic survey, follow-up interviews, and document analysis. And the instrumentation in the qualitative research study, the primary goal is to discover, is the discovery of information, and the researcher is the primary instrument. So the researcher is the one that will ensure that the data that are collected, how they are collected, when they are collected, when they are stored, and how they are used, and how the participants are kept in loop, getting consent from them, and making sure that the integrity of the study is maintained throughout this process. The data analysis is going to start by the return of the survey through SurveyMonkey online. And then the interviews are going to be conducted by the researcher with the identified people. The interviews are only going to be done um, for 10 selected students and teachers. So those 10 are going to be selected based on the results of the survey, how the participants, the 1,500 participants, what they answer on the survey will determine if they are selected for the interview. So the credibility and the internal validity of the study will be accomplished by using triangulation, members check, and reflexity. Now, this study, although focused on schools in sub-Saharan Africa, we provide a framework that other organizations can use to overlay on their own industry. So if you have a setting in sub-Saharan Africa, this study is important and it's transferable. So the lessons from this study can be used in the medical field, it can be used in education, it can be used in the military. It's applicable in the different settings that you have. So there's transferability in built in into the research work. And that is one of the benefits of using the HPT model. The expected results through the surveys and the follow-up interviews and the document reviews, the researcher expects the study would result in the development of a serviceable theological framework using the HPT model for schools for other researchers to consider, apply, and build upon. So the goal of this researcher is that at the end of this project, a framework will have been designed that can be used for other projects in sub-Saharan Africa, and so that the introduction of initiatives can go through a defined methodology and a benchmark system can be put in place, and then gaps can be identified, the system can be evaluated, and then the human performance attribute can be measured in an empirical way, so that the introduction of those initiatives can be can be the value of them can be readily documented. Right now, that doesn't really exist. And then other researchers also can take this research work, since it's based on theories and based on principles that are well founded, and use those data to actually look at other areas of the schools. Like they can look at the finance, they can look at the human resources, they can look at so many other areas of the schools that impact human performance. But this framework allows them to be able to do that. Now, there are ethical issues that are going to be considered during this um, research work. Now, the proper authorization will be obtained from the school authorities before this research work is started. The research protocol will be shared with relevant authorities for approval before the start of data collection. There will be a written consent will be obtained from all. In conclusion, with the continuous advancement in technology and then the uncertainty about how to plan, implement, and use technology in particular in education, now we am looking at gamification or gamified applications. This research would explore whether I will take some questions if you have. I do have the